Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to today's session, which is going to be ALM Best Practices with Salesforce Sandbox. As with all presentations at Salesforce, I'm going to give you a reminder. We will be talking about some new products and services, specifically Salesforce DX. This is a product that's currently in beta, and we just wanted to make a reminder that you should only make purchasing decisions based upon products that are currently available in market. So a quick introduction. My name is Natala Menezes. I'm a product director on the product marketing team for Sandboxes, ALM, and Salesforce DX. And I am really thrilled to be here with my colleague, Rohit Mehta, who is actually the product manager on Salesforce Sandboxes, as well as Scratch Orgs.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us today.
We know there are a lot of, I know we were talking about this, there's a lot of sessions here at the conference that you can pick from, and we're really excited to have this time with you. We did want to make the conversation a true conversation, so if at any time you have a question or thoughts or feedback or an experience you wanted to share, just raise your hand and we'll have our glorious mic runner, Ruth, come over and say hi and answer your questions. So definitely, if any time you have something you want to say, raise your hand and we'll have you join and participate in the conversation.
Yeah, and we'll have time at the end for some Q&A as well, and so we are happy to answer any questions you have.
Awesome. So let's just dig in. This is something I refer to sometimes as ways in which you can practice Safe SaaS. But what does that really mean? What we really want to think about is how do you build products in an efficient and safe way across the development cycle when you go from ideation through to building, to code and build, and then through test and release processes. And that process is what we call the ALM, or the Application Lifecycle Management process, and it's core to how we think about the tools that we're providing to you across Salesforce DX and Sandboxes.
Right, and application lifecycle management doesn't just include processes for new apps and features. You can extend it to any kind of change that you're making to any of your applications. These could be existing applications that you're trying to enhance. These could be production bug fixes that have to go through development stage, some testing, some kind of UAT, and then finally to production. So we're talking about changes to any kind of customizations that you have on the platform.
And this is the core framework that we try to use when we're thinking about building apps on Salesforce. When we think about Sandbox, we really think of these as environments that are the glue of ALM. We designed and created them to support your ALM processes with 4 distinct types of sandboxes.
Yeah, sandboxes are a very essential part of ALM at Salesforce. We have 4 different types of sandboxes, each with a slight variation of what they can offer and what they can be used for. So Natala, what are the 4 types?
So there are 4 kinds of sandboxes. The first are 2 variations of a developer sandbox, the developer and the developer pro. Both of those are really meant to be used by individual developers for that code process of building out your first framework. Yes, you had a question? We're going to spend a whole section on Scratch sandboxes, which are actually not called sandboxes, they're called Scratch orgs. And that's because they're a different kind of environment than a sandbox. They're what I call sometimes naked orgs. They don't have any metadata in them. But the second half of the presentation talks a little bit more about Scratch orgs and how you can use DX with sandboxes. So the other 2 types of sandboxes that we have are partial and full copy. So all sandboxes include your metadata. We do all the hard work of bringing in your metadata into your sandbox environment. With partial and full copy sandboxes, we also make it easy for you to have actual customer data that you can use in the sandbox. A full copy is an actual replica, a true mirror of your production environment. It has all your metadata and all your customer data ported into a single environment.
Yeah, and these sandboxes are standalone environments. These have no kind of attachment to your production org. Any changes that you make in your sandbox environment are safe from your production. So if you're making any breaking changes, they will not affect your end users. If you make some changes that you don't like, you can refresh away your sandbox, and again, it won't affect your production users. So like I said, the 4 types of sandboxes, they pull together all your configuration, but they also bring in some data. This is vital for the different stages of your development pipeline. So let's kind of walk through the stages of your pipeline. You typically start off with some kind of design and development of your changes. And then you build those changes, you test those changes, you do some kind of unit testing along those changes. And then you move along to a little bit more wide-scale testing, integration testing, functional testing, some kind of load testing possibly, And then finally, when you are ready with all your changes, you want to stage these changes. You want to get your sales teams on board with your changes. You want them to know what applications you're developing and how these applications should be used. You also want your product owners, the different stakeholders, to start working with these applications to make sure that they work the way they expect them to work in production. And then when all is said and done and everything's ready, that's when you're finally deploying it to production. So these different sandboxes that Natala spoke to, right? They can be leveraged in these different stages of your pipeline. So Natala, for example, where would you see a developer sandbox used in a partial sandbox for that matter?
Our recommendation is to use those developer sandboxes for ideation, so the build and code processes. And then when you get into the integration, so you're trying to figure out how will this new piece of code fit with the existing applications you might have enabled in your app into Salesforce, you would do that in a partial sandbox. You have a mix of customer data as well as the full environment available to you.
Right, and then finally, when you're done with all your functional testing and you want to move to more large-scale testing, you need a little bit more data to work with. Full sandboxes are great because they pull over all your data from your production org. Moving data is hard. Very often if you use the public APIs, they will run against the limits that you have on your public APIs. Full sandboxes help move that data over in a very efficient way, and it's much faster than you can ever do with existing APIs.
Absolutely. So the next thing we wanted to share was some tips. We spent a lot of time over the last few months talking to customers about how they use sandboxes, and there were some key trends that we heard that really make a difference in the performance of their application development process and really to the efficiency and speed with which they build new products. The first is a phrase that we heard from a customer. They were in the military, and it was slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So I'm one of those people, when I hear process, I think, oh no, this is going to slow me down and I don't want to be any part of it. Let's get rid of the rules so I can go faster. But it turns out, particularly with ALM, when you put some infrastructure in place, some process in place, you actually can speed up your development process. And that's where slow is smooth and smooth is fast. When you take the time to slow down, put down, okay, we're going to use a developer sandbox for these types of use cases. We're going to do integration testing in a partial sandbox, and we're going to do staging and performance testing in a full sandbox and have a structure on when those will be available. So every 2 weeks, we're going to refresh our dev sandboxes. Every month, we're going to refresh our full sandbox and have that documented process in place. It turns out that you can set expectations across your different development organizations, and everyone can align to that. So it creates a smooth process, and ultimately, that smooth process is faster.
Yeah, it just generates more goodwill amongst the different teams. Your developers are happy because they know what process to adhere to. Your product owners and stakeholders, they understand when they should expect certain changes, and so there's a cohesion and some cadence to when you're making application changes.
So the next one is governance. Governance, when we think about it, really is all about users and users having the right access. So what kind of roles do I want my developers or testers to have when they're in a sandbox environment? And in particular, what kind of data should they have access to? And that's a really critical part of that. And I think the other part is...
Yeah, a good example of it is you may not want your development team to have access to your production data, but the product owners, the stakeholders, they may want to be able to test against real production data. In that case, you can limit the login access to a certain set of users in your full sandbox while giving them full rights to a developer sandbox where they don't have access to data. Governance can also include understanding which environments are used for what use cases. You want to lock down certain environments for just development use cases. You want to lock down certain other environments for integration. And then finally, a third set of environments for UAT, where you just don't want any changes that have not gone through some kind of testing to make it to those sandboxes. So putting all of those changes and defining them is very essential.
And I think the other part that's really critical with governance is having documentation so that you have an audit trail. So when you have those user roles assigned to your developers and clear segregation of duties and tactics and what they can actually do in a sandbox, you also can create a way in which you can audit who did what and when did they do it. And that's a really important part of the governance process.
Right. I think the when is just as important as who did it. For example, sandboxes get upgraded at different times compared to your production org. You have what we call the preview sandbox period, where the sandboxes get upgraded before your production org. And very often you can refresh your sandbox to test some of your application changes before your production org has moved to that newer version of Salesforce. As you know, Salesforce has 3 major releases in a year at a 4-month cadence. And the sandboxes, half of the sandbox pods within Salesforce get upgraded earlier on. There is a blog that gets published around scheduling of your refreshes to get a version of Salesforce on this new upgraded sandbox. Knowing and documenting that process makes it that much easier for you to know which sandbox to test on. Which is the summer 17 sandbox, which is the spring 17 sandbox. This kind of removes all the confusion. Just knowing who is refreshing it, when they're refreshing it, are they aligning to Salesforce refreshes? Are they aligning to the processes within your own org as well?
So the next tip that we heard was testing strategy. So you've now got your users and your processes and policies and which sandbox to use when, but figuring out the right testing strategy for where you're going to do UAT, where are you going to have training done for new users, where are you going to integrate your code is a really essential part of it, especially when you start adding in things like a CI, some of the automation that we know that we can see. Right.
There are times when you want to upload some data very specific to your use case, right? And you're doing that in a Dev Pro sandbox, which has a 1 gig data limit. You may want to lock that down for integration. And so your testing strategy might involve 3 different types of test cycles. Something that is unit testing, but then something which is a little wider than unit testing, and then finally something that's more performance testing related. Knowing where you're running these tests and kind of just making sure that everyone understands is a very easy approach to being as effective as possible and covering all your use cases.
So number 4 is probably my favorite thing to do, which is post-copy scripting. So lots of times when you have production data, there's actually confidential information, social security numbers, health data, things that you don't want developers or really anyone outside of a very limited group to have access to. With post-copy scripting, you can enable a script to run when a sandbox is spun up, so that all of that information is masked automatically.
Yeah, one common feedback we would get is that the sandbox would be available, people would be able to log into that sandbox, and there was data that was had personally identifiable information, PIIs that some of your developers shouldn't have had access to. By having this post-copy scripting feature, you can now specify an Apex class as part of the sandbox creation process. This Apex class gets run towards the end of your sandbox process, but before the sandbox is ready for your users to log in. So you can imagine that you can change your permission sets. You can assign access and remove access from certain users, but also obfuscate data so that these users and the data that they shouldn't be looking at is not revealed to them.
And the last one is probably your favorite, which is automation. Having automation throughout your process is what will actually make it flow the easiest. And I think when it comes particularly to managing your sandboxes, that automated process will actually be what speeds you up the most.
Yeah, once you're comfortable with using sandboxes, once you've got your process locked down, your role and your governance system locked down, you can start getting a little bit fancier, right? You can start figuring out, okay, how do I want to pull out as much efficiency from this system that I've now put in place, and everyone's working on it, everyone understands it. And a good way to do it is by automating, introducing CI systems, introducing version control systems. A lot of customers, they understand version control systems. They are sophisticated enough to get started with them as soon as they are customizing on the platform. And for some others, they start learning about it much later, and then they move on and integrate it with their current processes. By letting you automate, you can, we have Sandbox APIs. These Sandbox APIs let you create, delete, refresh, and also check the status of a sandbox. You can imagine a CI system that is waiting on certain check-ins to happen in your version control system, and then automatically refreshing a sandbox, and then setting the stage for your tests to run. And at some point, you can, after you've done with your tests, You can create another pull request for the next branch in your version control system to have those changes merged in, so you're moving a step closer to production without necessarily having any human involvement. It is a little bit more automated, more efficient, while not giving up on quality.
Awesome. So again, since we've been spending some time in the field, we've been talking to customers about what their actual sandbox flows look like. And so this is not the picture to take a picture, the screen to take a picture of, because this is what a flow should not look like. I often joke that this customer flow gives me a little bit of the shivers and a little bit of nightmares, because there's a few things happening here. First,
well, why don't we ask people, what do you think is wrong with this picture? Sorry, say that again?
Dev to prod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else? What else is wrong? I don't even know what's wrong because it just looks so wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. The reason this sandbox, this picture gives us nightmares is not because of all the arrows crossing each other, but more so because I don't know where is the flow? Where's the flow of change happening? Right. You cannot point to one environment that's pushing its changes to the final production environment. I mean, if production was not colored differently, I wouldn't even know which is production out here, right? And so this layout just adds a lot of complexity and confusion. It adds the probability, it increases the probability of having bugs creeping into your final changes.
I mean, and lots of code collisions, right?
Right, a lot of merges that you have to deal with, correct, and having to do it in production. So having a very simplified yet well-understood system in place is something that's almost essential. It's, anything past that is just detrimental to your own self and your own process.
And our real goal is to provide a toolkit that you can use so that you have fewer errors in production, and so that production maintains its place as being the place where the code has been tested and works it to perfection. And so when we looked at this environment, which we saw many times when we talked to customers, we really thought about what would work most effectively and efficiently with the toolkit that we had in market today. And this is what it really looks like. So this is the ideal flow with ALM Best Practices. This is the one I would take a picture of. And the thing that you see here is every single developer has their own dev sandbox. So they can actually have their own environment where they work with the metadata to build applications and tools and to really have a place for ideation. Once they've decided that their code has passed their own individual unit tests, they're then going to ship it to an integration environment within their own dev team. So in this what you're seeing here is you have one feature team that ships on a monthly release cycle, and you have one feature team that ships on a quarterly release cycle, or an app team. And obviously, there's sometimes a flow for a hotfix team that might ship on a weekly basis. But in this case, you have these different teams working sort of in isolation from each other, but collaborating within their own groups. They move to Dev Pro, where they do the integration across those different individual developers, and then they leverage the partial sandbox as a place where those two code bases come together. In the case of the monthly release team, they're going to hit that partial sandbox every month and then ship from that partial to the full and then to production through that monthly cadence. On a quarterly basis, they'll be joined by their partner team who ships on that once a quarter. They'll sort of have two merging trains, and then they'll all go out in the same release train. But the nice thing about this sort of flow, one is it's easily documented and communicated within the organization, and two, it's auditable. You know when someone is pushing code from one environment to the next, that it's gotten through certain processes and policies to vet that code, and you also have clear integration points where they can have their code tested against other new applications or modifications that are being part of that train.
Right, and they incorporate all the different sandboxes that we spoke about. You have the full sandboxes that you can't refresh them as often, and part of the reason for that is it's a obvious choice that we made, because typically if you're doing UAT on that sandbox, you don't need that data to change every day or every week, versus your developer sandbox, that could be refreshed faster because you have different teams working on different cadences, different sprints, and have the need to refresh them much sooner. So the choice of sandboxes that we provide are well mapped with the different use cases and the different functions that you might need in your entire life cycle.
Do you guys have any questions about our ideal flow?
Again, this is just a model flow, right? This is what we think works best when customers adhere to it 100%, document it, understand it. Variations to this flow, there are so many of them. And what works best with your organization is what you've evolved over time and what works, in terms of the changes that you're trying to make. And this is not a one-fit-all solution. This is just a model solution.
Sure.
So if you're doing a hot fix, where would you start? Would you start
So what? Just for the hotfix flow that we recommend is typically to go from a dev sandbox, potentially using a dev pro for additional integration testing if you have multiple,
right.
And then from there, depending on the scale, either to a full or to prod, depending on what kind of hotfix you're doing.
Still kind of going through 3 or 4 different sandboxes.
So
you may not always, right? You may
So
not
for
always need to have the same pipeline for a hotfix. A hotfix could typically involve fewer developers, and you don't need as many environments involved in that. So you can imagine a dev sandbox that is being integrated directly into the partial sandbox or into the full sandbox, because the scope of your change is ideally small. It's not something that is radically changing your application. So if it involves fewer environments, that is okay, as long as you're integrating it in some environment where other swim lanes will be pushing the changes to.
Right. So let's say that we did the hotfix in dev merge sandbox because no matter how many projects teams are working, it kind of goes through the dev merge sandbox, right? So we do the hotfix, move from dev merge to partial to UAT and prod. Would you push that change, which is in prod now, back to those individual dev boxes?
Right.
Probably yes, because...
Yeah, and so the reason why we have worked on Salesforce DX and why there's so much of it out here is to answer this question around treating your org as a source of truth. And so I'll be speaking to that a little bit more at the end of this talk.
I feel that for a hotfix that is 1 hour SLA, I don't know how you're going to do it this way.
So actually for the hotfix, we recommend, what we have often seen is that you have a documented process for major code changes, and for hotfixes, you'll go from a dev sandbox to a dev pro, where you bring all of your hotfixes together in one environment and then go directly to production. We debated putting it on this slide, but sometimes it becomes such a distraction from what an ideal flow works for complex
Do you have
changes.
anything better than that?
So the alternative to that is to have an available full sandbox or a partial sandbox with a shorter refresh cycle, probably a partial that you could do your hotfixes through. So instead of doing your merge in a dev pro, do your merge in a partial sandbox. But we have just heard from a lot of customers that they're trying to manage their larger sandboxes more. And so it's pricey and it's a slow, like the other part with this, full sandbox has all your data in it, so it has a slower refresh. The partial has a 5-day turnaround on the refresh, and it sometimes can be better for those hot fix environments. And then you can join the train, you can have them refreshed or added to the train for your monthly release cycle. That is, I think, one of the challenges with hot fixes versus more standard development processes, but that's typically what we recommend.
So another question?
Oh.
When and how do you do the code merge, like in terms of you have a monthly release going on at the top and then you have a quarterly. So suppose both the teams are working on a common piece of functionality, like say an opportunity trigger or something, right? So do you do, whenever the team 2 is done with their story, is that time the code goes into their branch, or when is it check in and when is it merge with this? Because if they're working on the same piece of code, that whatever team 2 is working needs to be merged, but it should not go to production, right? Till the time that release is fully ready. So how do you manage that in this flow?
So ideally, your team 2 is working on the change, and you said whenever it's ready.
Say the user story is done, right? So do you check in into the branch at that point, or do you really wait till the end of the quarter and then you do a big bang merge to see? And because during that time, 3 months work might have been done on that opportunity screen or whatever file, right?
Yeah. And so hopefully you have a release cadence which is bringing alignment between your teams. So if you are looking at one big push, which Salesforce does one big push every 4 months, you are pulling all those changes and holding them off in your Dev Pro sandbox, right? That's where you're integrating and holding all your changes from all the different developers working towards the quarterly app release. At that point, you're merging those changes into your partial. Does that sufficiently answer?
So in the case,
so you're suggesting that the merge is done at a quarterly whenever the whole release is ready?
The merge is done in your Dev Pro until when you're ready to release the app.
so I think, in your case, you're talking about a piece of code that's being leveraged by both teams, one on a monthly basis and one on a quarterly basis.
Yeah, because the challenge we have is we have the hot fixes going on, which is quick hits on nightly, 2 times, 3 times a week. Then we have a weekly Scrum or Sprint release going on. Then we have some capabilities which are rolled out at the end of this month. One is getting rolled out end of 2 months kind of thing, right? So it's pretty ad hoc. So there is no every 2-week kind of a release cycle. So it's very tough to manage the code base where you have multiple teams working, and then every time you go to this partial sandbox, you need to do manual merge and make sure that the functionality which is not supposed to go to production, you're taking that out so that you're not doing a partial release into prod and all that kind of thing.
So what we've seen is that sometimes we will hold the check-ins that aren't going to be part of that release into their Dev Pro, and only push to the parts that are flowing forward will go through the process. So that's what you see. The partial should reflect what's going to ship in that month release. So if you have a piece of code or a check-in that's going to be shipped on the quarterly cycle, you would hold it in your Dev Pro sandbox until you were ready to merge it into the train that would actually be releasing. That's sort of a best practice. I agree. It's super. There's so many variations, and it's super hard.
Yeah, that's a big effort, right? You're waiting for 3 months, and then that file might have completely changed, and still need to put in a lot of effort and merging.
Yep.
You can include it and turn the flag off. Oh, I think feature flags could also help here. You could include the code, but have that feature turned off.
You can do that. You can have flags and switching, but most of the times, based on the requirement, it's not that easy, right? Because you have the out of the box, the capabilities, and then you have custom codes. It's not like just turning on a flag and custom setting. And we have explored that, but yeah.
Yeah. So when you have a more complicated process and you have a lot of developers working on it, this model of org-centric development does break down. And so we'll speak to how DX can help with some of those challenges. DX was built because of all the complexities around managing changes and pushing changes between environments. That's the problem we're trying to solve. And so I'll speak to that in a little bit.
I definitely think our model today has a sequential component to it, which is things need to be followed in that sequence for them to be shipped. And so when you have parts or components that you want to hold back or continue to modify, there are some breakdowns, and using some of the new tools with DX and moving your source of truth outside of the org is definitely going to help with that. Before we get into that, though, I think we do want to talk a little bit about, we are going to get to a section on scratch orgs and DX, so
yeah, so
we'll talk in a little bit more detail about some of those details. But we did want to talk about integrating automation and source control into your current sandbox flow.
So the reason we put this slide is because this is how you leverage automation with sandbox environments. And when I start talking about scratch orgs, the picture will be a little bit clearer. You can imagine here that your changes are being managed through a version control system, right? So you're using version control system for doing your merges, for doing your branching strategy, for having different changes being, you can cherry pick which feature or what check-in you want to pull into your monthly branch from your quarterly branch, for that matter. And so you're leveraging the version control system for merging, because that's a great place to do that. You're not relying on environments, essentially, to do any of your merges. With a CI system, again, you can push your code in the different environments that you would like your testing to run. And when you're running your tests and when you're sufficiently comfortable with those changes, move it from your version control system back into a full sandbox or your production directly. Again, I will reference this diagram a little bit a little bit later when we talk about Scratch orgs.
So we just wanted to recap the benefits of good ALM design. Our real focus on is really around reducing operational risk. We design Sandboxes to provide you with the environments you can do different kinds of testing in. And our goal is to give you flows and examples that increase your productivity and increase your efficiencies overall. We're Salesforce. What we really care about is making sure that our customers are happier. And the best way to make customers happier and developers happy is to not have collisions in production environments that lead to beeper calls in the middle of the night. And we find that good ALM practices are what are sort of the core of making those transitions to new apps and new innovation in your Salesforce environment a reality.
Yeah, making changes in production is not the way to go. We see a lot of times people make changes and break something and would like something as simple as an undo button, but while that's something that's a whole.
The Sandboxes are your undo button.
A sandbox is not a button, but yes, it is. It is something where you can make changes without worrying about breaking it in production. Yes.
I guess on that note, sometimes developers are just careless, or you just don't realize the only way to differentiate production versus sandbox is really your URL.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way to really differentiate production and your sandbox is your URL. If you don't notice that you're on login.salesforce instead of test.salesforce, accidentally went in and made everything in production. I don't know if you guys have any suggestions about that.
Yeah, so we did introduce a banner to make sandboxes clearer to identify, and so you will see a sandbox banner inside your Sandbox org. So hopefully you're not.
Next release.
No, it's out there right now. Yeah.
Was it released in the current release?
No, I think it's been there for at least for a while, for a year now. Say what? Okay, great.
I got a quick question. I heard that Sandboxes have an API limit of 5 million API calls. I thought I spun up a Sandbox the other day, and it only had like 25,000 API calls.
We can talk about that. The Sandboxes should have the same API limits as your production org. So it should not be any different than a production org, unless it's less than 5 million or whatever in a production org. Okay.
So is there any difference, I guess, with the ideal flow of ALM? And if your VCS is GitHub and you're forking from different developers, you're using the forking part of GitHub, does that change any type of, if you're trying to do a POC off of a fork of another developer for some odd reason, does that, I don't know, change the flow or?
No, as long as you have branches which are have a one-to-one relation with the environment where you're saying that this is going to be your quarterly integration branch and your monthly integration branch and environment, you want to merge those changes in that branch and test it on that sandbox before you move on to the next step in your pipeline.
So now we're going to talk about the thing that everyone wants to talk about, which is Salesforce DX and Scratch orgs and Sandbox.
This is the elephant in the room, right?
It's the elephant in the room. I think it's the Astro in the room, probably.
The Astro in the room. Cody in the room.
Cody in the room. So, we talked originally about we talked a little bit about the ALM lifecycle. What we now are trying to do with the Salesforce DX toolkit is really bring together a suite of tools that you can use across the ALM lifecycle to do faster development and to really use the tools and languages and processes that you already know and love. Part of this shift is also the shift from an org-driven model to a source-driven model, and you'll see some of that shift and change as we think about new ways in which you should do ALM and the way in which you should think about moving code from ideation to production.
Yeah, and this new model, Sandboxes, will still exist. And I'll show you how Sandboxes will exist. They'll play a slightly different role than what they have. For some users, working in orgs and moving changes through orgs works fine for them. They built entire processes around them, and we don't think it's necessarily wrong. It just breaks down or makes it harder for larger teams and bigger scope of changes, which is why we've introduced DX and these new type of environments called Scratch orgs, and this whole notion around source-centric development. So what are Scratch orgs, right? Scratch orgs so first of all, they're not called sandboxes, they're called scratch orgs, but they're kind of like sandboxes in the sense that they are standalone environments. Any changes that you make in this environment is not affecting any other environment, any production environment. Secondly, you're not changing, think of scratch org as an extension of your developer workspace, right? As an extension to your IDE. You're making changes, testing your changes in a scratch org without relying on these scratch orgs or necessarily having to hang on to these scratch orgs for long periods of time, right? Developer sandboxes, partial sandboxes, full sandboxes, they can persist. If you load test data in a developer sandbox, that sandbox can be kept on for a long time to make any kind of, to run tests on. So if you loaded some sample tests, that will persist. If you load any kind of unit test data in a scratch org, that will last only for the duration of your scratch org. And since scratch orgs are meant to be ephemeral and short-lasting, ideally you're just loading small subsets of data for your tests. So think of scratch orgs as where you run your day-to-day development, maybe some CI processes for running some tests, but not using it for staging for UAT. That is all done in a sandbox org.
The other key thing, I think you hit upon this that I always think about is that your scratch orgs are just an org. They're empty, whereas your sandboxes come with all your metadata already, and then they'll come with some component of data. So they're very distinct types of environments, even though they're within that range of available environments.
Yeah.
But their use case is really meant to be for ideation and then for cross-org changes.
Right. Again, sandboxes are meant for managing your data and pulling your data from your production org into a separate standalone org without having to hit any of those external public APIs. Right? Internal systems are much more efficient in moving data around than those public APIs, and that's what sandboxes can be leveraged for.
So when it comes to putting your working with sandboxes and scratch orgs, we really do see them playing an integral role. And in this, this diagram, which is very similar to the one from before, what you see here is that our scratch orgs have replaced our developer sandboxes. You still do integration through a dev sandbox. You still do, you do some of those integration and UAT testing, some of your CI in other types of sandboxes throughout that flow process, but it's no longer linear in structure. Everything is going through your source control system and through CI.
Right, and your swim lanes, the different code paths for your bug fixes, your weekly trains, your monthly trains, they're all managed through a version control system, right? You have different branches that you're leveraging for different scope of changes. Your developers are forking code based on what's being checked into your prod branch, for example, or your stage branch. And in the case of prod support, you're working on a scratch org, pushing it into possibly the full sandbox for some kind of testing and UAT before rolling it out to production. So your merge strategy is happening within the realm of a version control system, including, and this includes not just your Apex code, but also your metadata.
Little dots that means they're working as scratch orgs.
So the dots are just because they're ephemeral. So unlike a regular sandbox, which is persistent, and you can actually keep a sandbox for as long as you want. We've met people who have had sandboxes without refreshing them for 6, 9, 12, 10 months. They're like babies.
Yeah, we were going to throw the reference of a smoke monster since there's the Lost producer speaking right after this. But
oh yeah, the numbers are, we don't want to make you late to the last session.
So what is the purpose of that one dev sandbox?
Yeah, so the dev sandbox, again, you can load it with, it's meant for integration. It's meant for some kind of tests. You're loading that sandbox with your own data. As you know, partial sandboxes come with a 5 gig data limit, and we sample that data from your production org. Dev and Dev Pro sandboxes have this limit with no data at all. And so you can push whatever data you want, hang on to that, for long periods of time, and use it for integration testing. Yes?
Question about where do your admins work? So do they work in the staging environment? And there's sometimes a conflict between the dev changes and the admin changes, right? And Salesforce, it all has to work together. So do you recommend they make changes in the staging environment or directly in production? I doubt you'd recommend that.
So, yeah, admins should not be working any differently from a developer. They should have their own dev sandbox that they're making changes in. They should be, integrating the changes into the next sandbox that comes in the pipeline, or the version control system if they understand some of the processes around or understand the tools and know how to use them. But they should not be working any differently than developers do.
So what we recommend is putting in a low-code or citizen development process for your admin developers. Again, that goes back to having good ALM structure. And so sometimes that means that developers will set up those sandbox environments for your admin and say, okay, we've got this place, here's the location to go make your changes. And then the development team will move those code changes through your ALM process. The citizen developer, the admin, may not have the skills to manage that code promotion process or through that change control. Although we do have tutorials that can teach them some of the basics about promoting code and moving it through that process. But we find that if you actually have a citizen development flow, and you say, okay, if you're going to make changes, because there are so many enthusiasts. Salesforce is really approachable. You can build something in Process Builder without having a lot of professional code experience. And we want to support those types of activities, but we also want to make sure that they're repeatable and tested and actually work in production. And so what we recommend is having them build them in either a dev or a partial environment. I sometimes personally have seen that the partial where they have a larger data set is actually easier for an admin to work in because it's more familiar to them, and they oftentimes queue off of data just from a process and workflow perspective. And then you manage the promotion of their code and when that happens, and that also allows you to set timelines. Okay, you're going to have 15 days, 30 days, whatever time frame you need to build your thing, and then at the end of that time, we're going to run it through a test process, a UAT process, and it'll be promoted and go into production. And that's, again, going back to process. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. It slows down the iterative, quick, fasting citizen developer, but ultimately, there's fewer errors in production, which actually makes everyone happier.
Any word on unsupported metadata types? It's been the weak link for admin changes where it's not necessarily something reflected on metadata, which means it's not reflected on the VCS, which means people would need to have some manual steps recorded on some text file that maybe you then keep on VCS. So.
Yeah, and we are aware of those. We are working as hard as possible to get those holes plugged in. It's going to be a moving goalpost in some ways, right? We keep introducing new metadata types every release, and while we strive to get them API compatible in the very first release that they're introduced in, invariably we fall back, and so we fall short. But we're trying to get there, trying to get to 100% metadata completeness.
What's your suggestion for dealing with those? The only suggestion I've seen is Selenium, which is not ideal.
Yeah, I mean, making those changes directly in your full sandbox instead of doing it in your developer sandbox. I don't know. Josh, do you know the answer to that? Yeah.
What was the answer?
It's not easy to do those changes. We are aware of those. We're trying to work towards them.
We're working on it, I think, is the takeaway.
Okay.
So we'll stay for Q&A, and we know that there's the next session is going to be starting the keynote. I'm a big Lost and Leftovers fan, so I'm planning to walk over there as well. But we did want to keep you guys. We will stay here. Just as a quick reminder, we have 4 new trails for DX and 2 existing trails for ALM and Sandboxes, change management. We highly recommend them as ways to learn and become a Sandbox ALM DX expert. We're going to hang around. We'll probably also migrate upstairs for the keynote. But we're here to answer your questions. We're all available. Rohit and I are both on Twitter, so you can always tweet it at us, and we'll answer your questions there too.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.